Check one, check two. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are watching this video. I appreciate you taking the time. My name is Alexander Booth. I'm the head facilitator for the IBM Data Science cohort starting in January 2026. Crazy. Anyway, this is the week three quick recap and week four preview and breakdown of some of the stuff we'll be working through in the week four lab materials this week. Let's get after it. All right. Yeah, sorry this video is a little late coming out. We had a very, very busy week at work, and I have some work travel coming up uh tomorrow, Monday, whatever day it is. Anyway, let's get after it. Week three. If you go to the week three lounge and scroll all the way down, you should hopefully see a little recap video, a recap of the live session and just my thoughts for the week. All right, look at that. We got 2 likes. Stonks. Just kidding. Thanks, Yoris and James, as always, for reading the forums and my quick recaps. So, big idea of the week three. Again, where are we coming from? Where are we going? Week one, thinking like a data scientist. Week two, introduction to programming. How do we use Python? What is Python? What is thinking procedurally? What is thinking like a computer programmer? And then week three, we're starting to put those computer programming skills to use in a data sense, right? So in week three, we're going to be acquiring data, we're going to be scraping data, we're going to be extracting data, and then doing some manipulation, and finally some visualization. So for week three, we talked about writing Python, how interesting it can be that all these different languages have slightly different syntax, but the same logic underpinning all of them. And we talked about what exactly a data pipeline looks like. Again, as data scientists, we do need to be responsible for all parts of the data pipeline, even if you do specialize in one areas or another. I walked through this illustration during class where we looked at what a data pipeline looks on 3 cloud native solutions, AWS, which is Amazon's cloud, Azure, and GCP, which is Google's cloud. And we can see they all kind of do the same thing, right? We all start with data sources, whether it's coming from databases, APIs, other FTP servers, websites, XML, JSON, whatever, IoT devices. We bring all of these data sources in, we load them in some kind of system using ETL, extract, transform, and load into a database. And then finally, we can consume that data through machine learning models, through visualization tools, QuickSight, Power BI, Looker, ML tools, Vertex, Azure ML, and SageMaker. You see how those are all on the right of the data pipeline, while the raw data sources and ingestion through IoT and data sources are on the left of the data pipeline. And in the middle is our storage, whether it's a OLAP or OLTP or even just regular cloud storage. And OLAP and OLTP are just 2 different types of databases. You can think of OLAP being large analytical data warehouses, and OLTP being relational database management systems with low latency that power downstream applications. Well, so after we discussed kind of what is a data pipeline and why it's important to automate data pipelines and how to write data pipelines in code, we talked about different ways of starting on the left, consuming data from source. We talked about a couple different ways of doing that. The first is web scraping with BeautifulSoup. So we talked about HTML. We also talked about XML, aka your markup languages where data may be stored in. And we talked about how we can use and melt down these tree-like structures within markup languages to then quickly isolate specific elements that are relevant to us as a data scientist. And then finally, we talked about APIs as well as API wrappers. We interacted with the Yahoo Finance API via the yfinance wrapper library through Python. We made requests, received responses, and then parsed those responses out into data frames. And again, big idea here. Whenever we start with a source data vendor, we essentially want to extract, transform it inside of a Pandas data frame, and then load it into our downstream systems. We talked about how the whole ecosystem fits together. Python as your base language, Pandas and NumPy as your more complex data structures to store information, and how libraries can extend Python so we don't reinvent the wheel. To end the week last week, while the focus was mostly on the left of data pipelines and extracting information, we talked about how data can be consumed via analysts on the right. So bringing that in and actually having something consumable via for your technical or non-technical stakeholders. In this example, we talked about different types of visualizations. We actually made some line charts to visualize the price of GameStop and Apple over time, starting from 20 years ago up to today. We talked about the difference between static visualizations through Matplotlib and Pandas plotting, as well as interactive dashboard design through Plotly. We'll dive more into visualizations, I think, in week 6, where we will actually be building more fleshed out interactive data applications and dashboards. Logistic wise, we talked about how you can use Google Colab as a backup in case the IBM environment is not working for any reason, as well as using Kaggle Learn for supplemental practice. Cool. We also walked through the week 3 quiz. There was only like one thing that was pretty weird was one of the like, what's the content of the title tag? It actually wanted the answer with the title tags in it when I read it as just the text itself. I had some more information in the live session lounge if you want to go check that out. But do know that we are reviewing the quizzes and the results and your responses and any kind of weirdness and typos or anything there. So, big idea with week 3. You now know how to think like a data scientist. You now know our tools with computer programming. How do we start fitting that together into a data ecosystem with data pipelines, right? With automation and code, etc. And these data pipelines have to encompass the whole stack of data and data science, getting data from source, transforming it, consuming it in some kind of way for your stakeholders. So that's kind of big ideas for week 3. With week 4, we're going to start having a deep focus on databases. We're going to talk about how databases can be used for both the left as data sources, right? We're extracting data from databases to join or encompass into our larger data estate, or how databases can actually be put in the middle of our data pipelines, right? We can use databases as OLTP and OLAP sources, relational database systems for applications, and analytical data warehouses for big data consumption. Data can live there, and that's going to be the source for downstream business analysts. So next week, we're going to talk about what is a database, what is a relational database. We'll walk through basic DDL and DDM. I think DDM. I'm going to get on my acronyms. There's so many acronyms in databases. DML, there we go. We're going to walk through DDL and DML, which is just data definition and data manipulation in SQL. Goodness, I know there's so many. We'll just wait till we throw ACID at you as well. So many database and acronyms. Then we're going to talk about what is a database at a big level, how databases can be used as part of a data pipeline, how they can feed downstream systems as well as be used as sources. And yeah, we'll focus on organizing and querying it. Week 4, I'll get into week 4 now, actually. So let me jump into it. Week 4 is a big week. So make sure to participate in chat, ask questions as you go, and pay attention to this next few minutes here. So that's kind of my week 3 review, and let's dive into our week 4 preview. Good. Thanks, Yoris. Oh, we got a few likes going here. So popular. All right. Week 4, this is what we're currently in through Tuesday or Wednesday next week. With week 4, we are introing databases in the SQL language. And if you notice, week 4 is a really long week. We start from 4.1 and go all the way down to 4.18. And if you want to get really scared, if you look at, well, you can't see this, but on my view, here's all the labs you have to do this week, like technical hands-on labs, starting at 433 all the way down to 416. So not quite as many as week 2, but still well into double digits, which is wild. Anyway, how do I want you to focus on week 4? Week 4 is basically split in half. First, if you have zero database and zero SQL experience, you do need to work through all of the activities, especially what I'm going to call the IDE activities. Those are going to start in 4.3 and work through, I think, 4.9 or so. Essentially, that first half of the week is going to be talking about what is SQL, what is a database, right? How do you write basic SQL commands in SQL code? So just a high-level introduction to SQL. It's the second half of Unit 4 that's most important to me and most important to the boot camp itself. And that's going to be how do we start using SQL to power data science activities, right? So starting in 4.11, we're going to be back in Jupyter Notebooks, where we're going to learn how to write queries using Jupyter Notebooks, execute queries, interact with queries with pandas, and how to read data from databases into data frames, and how to write data frames back to databases. You'll finally be tasked with interacting with real world data from Chicago demographic statistics in both the real data practice and the final project. So if you do have some familiarity with SQL, I recommend skimming and completing or not completing the first half of the IDE activities and then jumping straight into the Jupyter Notebook activities in 4.11. As like I said, this is where SQL becomes practical and integrated with Python. And we'll work through what those look like here in this video, or what those two different types of labs look like here in this video. Big ideas for week 4, how to connect Python to a database, how to run queries through Jupyter Notebooks, how to convert results into data frames, how to read or write from data frames with SQL, and how databases fit into a larger data science workflow. Again, we're going to talk about data definition. How do we define schemas and structure of our data? And how do we data manipulate? How do we manipulate data through our databases? Creating tables, evolving schemas, and general SQL syntax. And then finally, where the real learning happens is going to be with the Jupyter notebooks. How do we pass Python variables into SQL queries? How do we convert results into data frames? How do we start dealing with real data with poor columns and dirty data inside of it, right? How do we write functions and transformations on top of that information we're pulling from databases? And then how do we pull all those big ideas together with a lot less handholding? All right, there's some logistics here, but what I want to leave you with before I start diving into some of the labs and the nuance and syntax is don't get stuck on the syntax, right? Just like anything else, just like week 2, we're trying to cover a lot in week 4, depending on everyone's skill set, right? If you come into this with zero technical experience, we got you. Just start at the beginning. Know you're going to be dedicating a lot of time this week, similar to week 2. If you do have some technical experience, then let's focus on more of the Python integrations with SQL. So yeah, big ideas. I don't care if you memorize SQL this week. And also, well, just a side note, just like we talked about how computer programming has different syntax for all of the languages, JavaScript is going to be different from Python, which is different than C Sharp, which is different than Rust, which is different than Go. SQL is actually kind of like that. If you start diving into SQL, you'll see that there are many different flavors of SQL dialects. There's T-SQL for SQL Server, DB-SQL for Databricks, Snow-SQL for Snowflake. Redshift has its own little flavor. BigQuery has its own flavor. So don't get stuck on syntax. Just like anything else, SQL is going to depend on the tool that you use, but focus on the big ideas. We use SQL and relational databases for a purpose. What is relational data? Why do we want strong controls in the schema and relationships between our data sets? How do we query those with more exotic commands like aggregations and filters? How do we join tables and informations together? How do we integrate back into pandas? Don't feel like you need to finish every lap 100%. Focus your energy on the Jupyter Notebook projects, and if you get stuck, always feel free to reach out in the lounge or live session thread. There's a couple good Kaggle learns on SQL. There's an intro to SQL one, which is really good, and there's also a advanced SQL one, which I've also done, which is definitely a little bit more out of scope for the depth that I care about in this boot camp, but it's still a really fun activity. And the thing I like about the Kaggle SQL learns is that they use BigQuery. So if you want to put BigQuery on your resume, getting some hands-on with Kaggle is super helpful. In our class, we're going to be using Postgres as our IDE database of choice, and then SQLite for interacting with Python. So if you do play your cards right, you have 3 different database systems going from file-based with SQLite to relational database systems with Postgres to cloud warehouses with BigQuery if you want to use all of your available resources here. Cool. And then if you need some more tutorials or reading on what is SQL or some of the things it can do, I like the W3 School SQL tutorials just for a general introduction to the SQL language and SQL databases. Again, the Kaggle Learn is more for like SQL for data science, while the W3 schools is more like what is SQL at a high level or in more specifics on syntax. Cool. So let's dive into some of the labs here, and then we'll dive into some of these things of like what is a magic command, all that jazz. So let's start with the IDE labs. So if you start with 4.3, we'll start with 4.3 here because they're all going to be pretty much based on the same thing. So again, this is not going to be opening a Jupyter notebook. What it's going to be doing is opening up what is called an IDE, an integrated, oh God, so many acronyms. IDE stand for Integrated Development Experience. That's my guess. Environment, integrated development environment. That makes a lot more sense than experience. Integrated development environment. So anyway, it's going to be just like a place where you can write code inside of just a basic system. Popular IDEs for Python, and you'll see that I have some of them open, is like Visual Studio Code, Cursor, um, IntelliJ, all that good stuff. So if you look at Visual Studio Code, or VS Code is how it's called in industry, or Visual Studio if you're a Microsoft shop. AI code editor now, sure. Anyway, you'll see that this is an example of an IDE, and actually the IDE that we use in the IBM materials this week is based off of Visual Studio Code, which is kind of cool. So anyway, definitely follow up on VS Code. And if you use Cursor, Cursor is based off of VS Code, which is kind of fun as well. VS Code's open source, which is why, I'm a big open source guy. Cool. Let's dive into, I think our lab's loaded here. So here's kind of what the lab looks like. Notice as I think I may have to show a couple other ones. As we start working through this, yeah, this is not the PHP lab one. This is just the practice SQL commands. So if we just look at this, we can submit the query and it should run and we get the results here at the bottom. And then it's going to say, hey, let's do this query instead. Here we go. Select title, director, writer from location. So we can copy this and then paste it here and then submit it. And it should run and see what we can see what it does. So we can see with this query, we only bring back these columns that we specified. So this is going to be very hand-holdy, kind of hands-on lecture, kind of walking you through the very basics of what SQL commands can be. So definitely work through it if you don't have too much SQL experience. So this is your first type of IDE lab. Again, pretty straightforward. You're just going to be writing basic SQL commands to practice SQL syntax inside of the environment. Know that this does not use PHP admin or Postgres or anything yet. So cool. And then you can close it and work your way through the next couple. I'm going to jump. Which one is the I'm trying to figure out which one is the PHP labs. Maybe starting with 407. Nope, that's the Watson one. 406, hopefully. 406, great. Oh, and it uses MySQL, not Postgres, but they're two flavors of the same thing. All right, so let's start with 406. I'm going to jump to 463 here. While this is loading, it is good to highlight that 4.7 is another optional IBM Watson activity. So remember last class where you could log into Watson and spin up kind of Jupyter servers through IBM's clouds. Similar idea in 4.7, you can go through Watson and spin up a IBM hosted database that you can then interact with for your personal projects or hobby projects. So it walks through creating a cloud native and cloud deployed database and then interacting with that database within other cloud services. Know that 4.7, anything with IBM Watson is always optional. So yeah, I don't even think I pulled in the instructions for it this time. And I'm not going to bother trying to pass this. There it is. Cool. So you can log through that and work through it. Again, you shouldn't have to pay anything. I recommend not providing a credit card. So yeah, that's my advice if you do go through Watson. All right, anyway, here we go. This is 4.6. specifically 463. And you'll notice that our lab looks slightly different. Look at our IDE here on the left. This is kind of what I mentioned of how it's going to start looking more closely to something through VS Code, or if you've ever worked with that IDE. So we have this IDE kind of framed here, and it kind of walks through what is a cloud IDE and all that good stuff. So definitely recommend reading some of this and then also reading the instructions. And you'll see that we're going to be using a database graphical user interface or GUI to interact with a MySQL database. There's lots of GUIs in the world for databases. Just a couple that I like that I'll throw out at you. I like dbeaver as a GUI. It's open source and it can connect to any database. It's a universal database explorer. Some of the other ones that I like is what? Beehive SQL. I don't even know. Beehive Studio. Beekeeper. There we go. I was close. Beekeeper Studio is also pretty good. The SQL editor and database manager of your dreams. There you go. And this can also interact with any relational database like MySQL, Postgres, SQLite, SQL Server, and it's also open source. I think I have dbeaver installed, but I've been meaning to move over to Beekeeper. The only reason why I don't use Beekeeper is because it doesn't interact with like too many of the oh it does got BigQuery now. It used to not really connect to many of the OLAPs that were out there, but I guess it does now. So anyway, Beekeeper is supposed to be the more like hip one these days. Anyway, we're going to be focusing on whatever PHP admin is, which is not kind of my favorite GUI, but it works for this experience. All right, so first let's create our database. Let's follow the instructions here. We need to go to databases up here at the top, MySQL, and then we're going to create a MySQL database. This will take a second. And this is what I want to focus on. When this does create a database here, we have this option to open the GUI either within our little iframe here inside the IDE or in a new tab. I recommend opening it in a new tab always. Opening it just in this tab, my experience with it was pretty poor, mostly because everything was getting cropped and there wasn't enough room to see things. Like it was not a good time. You couldn't like see anything. And this is still loading, but you can't even like scroll to the right here. So definitely don't open it in the IDE. Instead, open it in a new tab. And if I do click this button, this is going to open in a new tab in my browser. Late to greasy death. And here you can already see that like I got way more stuff loaded. So cool. So now that I have it in a new tab, we can continue to follow the instructions. We want to create a new database called MySQL Learners. So let's go into new, create a new database called MySQL Learners. It's going to say that it has to be all, you may get this invalid database name. This needs to be all lowercase with, I don't think we can even have the underscore. So there's a little bit of a typo in the instructions. Oh, that did work. So we got MySQL underscore learners. We have to be in all lowercase. And then from there, you can see we can walk through creating a table. We want to run this code. We can copy it in our GUI. We can click on the SQL tab and then paste this query in. Command or Control A to highlight everything. And then where's the run button? I already forgot. Is it being hidden under this? No. Click get auto saved query. Oh. Cool. Let's see what the instructions say to run it. Oh, click go. Where is go? Why am I blind? Oh, there it is. Go is right here at the bottom. Click go, and this should execute the tables. Sweet. And if I go back to structure, I can see that I have two tables now inside of my MySQL. So this is DDL, data definition language. Cool. And then you can run through the rest of the labs. So yeah, my advice when you get to this type of IDE lab, open up the MySQL server, MySQL database server in a new tab. I think I mentioned that in my notes here. The iframe inside the lab IDE tends to get cut off and make the GUI painful to use. Cool. So those are the two types of IDE labs. The first, you're just writing basic queries just to practice syntax. Second, you're interacting directly with a relational database server, in this case, MySQL. And then optionally, you have the chance to experience deploying a real database server that persists on IBM Watson through IBM Cloud. Sweet. So again, if you have no experience with SQL, I recommend running through all of those labs through 4.9. 4.9 also goes back to the MySQL IDE. Yeah, anything that's an enrichment activity, you don't have to do. Yeah, because this will be using the IBM DB2 system through Watson. So maybe I will download some of these as that's for my GitHub persistence. But yeah, anything that uses IBM DB2 is optional. Anything that goes through Watson is optional. Anything that's an enrichment activity is optional. All right, so let's dive into the labs that I actually care about. These are going to be 4.11, 4.13, and 4.16. Again, a couple of enrichment activities along the way that you can definitely skim over. So let's start with 4.11. 4.11 is going to have two different labs that basically introduce you to how SQLite works with the Databricks. So in my experience, I'm just going to open up the lab directly. Here's 4.11.3. I guess you have 3, 4, and 5. I'm going to start with 11.4. 11.4 and 5 are the more important ones. And I have all this code already backed up on my GitHub. I've run all the notebooks, so they all should work. But anyway, when we run SQL queries in Python, we're going to be using two types of commands to basically tell Jupyter Notebook that this is a SQL query that we are trying to execute. So you're going to see this here, right? We use these commands, this syntax to say, hey, Jupyter, this is a SQL command. So what's the difference between 1% sign and 2% signs? 1% sign means we have one line that's going to be SQL. So it's an inline SQL command. And 2% signs means this is going to be a multi-line SQL query. So it'll take up most of the entire cell. So let's see what that looks like in practice. We'll wait for this to load. Cool. Again, wait for the kernel to connect. I think that should be connected. And then we should be able to just kind of run through this. So I'm just going to walk through first. We're going to load the extension so we can manipulate with SQL. We're going to create a SQL database here, and then we should be able to write some commands. So notice we used a single percent sign to have a one-liner and then a double percent sign for a multi-line. Basically tell Jupyter Notebook that this whole cell is going to be SQL. So there we go. We've created a table and we should be able to see it over here. I guess we haven't maybe saved it yet. Let me save. Yeah, we should overwrite one of these databases. I think it's the SQLite magic one. Anyway, maybe when we close the commands here. So we'll just power through. Again, single percent sign for a one-line query. Select star from this table where country is equal my variable. And then again, you can see here we have the one-liner here. And this brings it back as a data frame table. And then we talked about how we can make this a data frame and then shove it through a matplotlib How cool. And then again, if I'm going to use 2% signs, I would usually make this a multi-line SQL query. Cool. And I think that takes us to the end. And I think that's it. So that's kind of one example of how these labs will look. And as we start moving into the final project, you'll see that you'll just have less hand-holding. I'm not going to go through the labs for those, but the big important ones are the 413 lab and the 416 lab. And then if you get stuck, feel free to always check my backups. Feel free to run it against Google Colab. And this is pulling real data, Chicago school data, Chicago demographic data, and Chicago crime data. We're going to have all three of these data sets loaded inside of my database. And then we're going to write queries against all of those. And my bias for this one seems to be to use double percent sign SQL. I'm trying to see where we use a join. Maybe closer to the bottom. Group bys, aggregations, pandas integrations. Here we go. Here's a join. So here we're joining two of the tables together, crime data and the census data, and then getting results back. So it should be fun, good practice for your SQL practice. Cool. So big idea for week 4. Don't get stuck on syntax. Skim over the IDE labs if you already have some familiarity with SQL. Focus on the Jupyter Notebook activities with Python and SQL. By the end of the week, you should feel comfortable creating tables, manipulating tables, DDL, DDM, DML, data manipulation language, creating tables and interacting with tables using general reads, using aggregations, and interacting with queries through Pandas data frames and Python. I mean, if you're curious on the documentation, PD read SQL is a good one. This is what we're going to be using for most of the time. How can we read SQL queries or databases into Pandas? Again, the beauty of Pandas, right? Last thing I had for week 4 was we got 3 forum posts this week, and there has been very little activity in them. So I love talking about SQL, the benefits and limitations of relational databases, thinking about the evolution of how we go from Oracle SQL Server to MySQL to Postgres to now BigQuery, Redshift, um, Azure, Snowflake, Databricks, all that good stuff. How do we go from OLTP to OLAP to Lakehouse to data mesh, all the different, I guess, philosophies of data organization today. So it's some good conversations that can be had this week. So please participate in the forums over the weekend. All right, I think that's all I had on my end. I will wrap this up because I think I'm way over my 15 to 20 minutes, and I will see you on Monday. Thanks, everyone.